Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you here today for this particular conference. We're discussing really relevant issues throughout the 2 days of this meet. And I'm delighted to host all my colleagues here for this particular panel discussion on political polarization. So political polarization is increasingly becoming a disturbing phenomenon of our times, tearing societal fabrics of both young and mature democracies. The ramifications stretch far beyond the political arena, especially when it comes to attracting talent as well as investors. So an increase in polarization can even mean civil war. Are we doing enough about it? We're not. And that's why it's been flagged as the key topic for today's plenary discussions. Allow me to introduce all my panelists one by one and draw them into the conversation. Let me begin with Dr. Abdul Rahman from the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, Vietnam, where he is a lecturer in the School of Communication and Design. Most recently, he's been working on digital and social media issues and groups that have been marginalized in Vietnam and Indonesia, and the resilience of civil society groups during a repressive time caused by the pandemic. What are your immediate thoughts on this issue?
Thank you, Shifali, and everybody. Before responding to your questions, I would like to acknowledge any members of marginalized groups who are probably sitting in the audience. Your presence is important in this conversation, so do not be afraid of speaking up. So I'm just going to respond to your questions. So let's put it this way. I would like to start that we are inherently tribal. Our tribes gives us comfort. It is the world where we're seeking help. This is something that gives us direct assistance during hard times. You're probably reaching out to your best friend when you want to find out about your feelings. You're probably thinking, who am I can talk with if I would like to share about my political point of views? So in this sense, when we are thinking about our tribes, it is healthy for our mental health. I would say our tribe is our strength. Having said that, those in power is trying to weaponize, or they have weaponized our tendency to be tribal into a virus that has torn our social fabrics. So the conversation I would like to hear here is that maybe we should embrace our tribalisms, our tendency to be tribal, but also how we can mitigate or quote-unquote neutralize the power of those who are wanting to take advantage of our tendency to be tribal. Maybe I'm going to start from that short start.
But I'm curious. So, when it comes to tribes, every tribe has unique characteristics, right? So, does social media enable engagement, or is that a barrier? There is also the language issue to think of.
Yeah, that's true. So, for those of you who have known me in person, I am a proponent of inclusions. So what I will be saying is that I have been researching conflicts and peace building within the last 7 years. And I've read a book about conflict continuity and change. I was looking at Indonesia as a case study. I was looking at Ambon, that I had experience of communal conflict from 1999 to 2004, and then from 2011 to 2012. What I observed back then, most people would say, yeah, the conflict between Muslim and Christian is about religion. But the question is it about religion, or is it about the invisible power who are trying to use religion, twist everything for whatever political, socio-technical, and economic and cultural gains they want to get? So when it comes to, again, polarizations, we should think that we are inherently polarized. But the question is, how can we manage our tendency to be self-righteous, to be, again, to believe in whatever we want to believe and become the advocates of everyone else who can amplify our tendency to be tribal?
Great. I'm going to come back to you in a short while. Let me next introduce Mr. Frank Pries from Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Germany. He is the Deputy Head of the Department for European and International Cooperation at CAS. I learned with great interest that he was part of CAS's Young Journalism program and became a journalist as well, but ultimately decided to return to CAS, and he has held several positions during his career. Mr. Frank Pries, what aspect of political polarization bothers you the most?
I would say there are different aspects as well. One is looking firsthand on one's own country and then worldwide. In Germany, I would say I'm quite much concerned about the shifts in the cohesion of society. When it comes today, for example, to the consequences of the pandemic, consequences of supply chain, losing jobs in industry. So Germany traditionally is a very balanced middle-class society. If you look to the socio-demographic patterns in Germany, you see that not so many people are very above the others, and not very much people are so much below the others. And this is changing a little bit in the mind of the people. The state with big programs, we spend more than 50% meanwhile of our national budget on social issues and on transfers, and this is not sustainable for a very long time, but it's the idea to hold the society together. And with the tendencies today, I'm concerned that this is an ever difficult task. Globalization has to do with it. We are normally thinking that globalization is when others in the world are buying our cars. We learned that this is not the only aspect in this issue. So for Germany, I would say this cohesion of the society concerns me. When I look to other countries, you see a lot of examples where this has the consequences that, for example, moderated candidates in elections do not even make it to the second round. I worked a long time in Latin America, and if you see the actual contest in Brazil, a country, and you have only the alternative between Mr. Bolsonaro and Mr. Lula, or you saw the contest in Colombia, there this kind of societal divide which is not easy and able to compromise in the center. This is a long tendency which started long ago, but now we see the consequences even in countries like the US, and I think this is concerning on the international level.
Yeah. I'm going to be touching on many of these issues during today's discussion, but the journalist in me is wanting to ask you, what impact has immigration had on the cohesion in societies in Germany itself?
Immigration is a factor. Germany is quite familiar with immigration since a long time. It started with foreign worker programs from other European countries first in the 60s when German industry had a lot of need of qualified labor. It was immigration from Greece, from Italy, from Yugoslavia. Now, later on, it was Turkey, and Germany didn't have this policy that, for example, foreign workers only are allowed to come alone and have 2 years and then are sent back to their countries. The families came, so this is a long experience, and today I would say we didn't do very well in integration, not with migration. And then afterwards, and everybody saw the effects in Germany after 2015, when it was a massive migration, especially from the war-affected countries like Syria, but as well from Northern Africa. And this, in the first moment, you saw in Germany an enormous welcome culture, people waiting even in the train stations for migrants, for refugees in this case. And then it shifted because numbers become greater. It had direct effects on people. For example, there was not enough housing, so they used even sports facilities in schools to have refugees there. This affected very personally personally. A lot of people say, okay, my children do not have sports any longer because this is needed for other places. It was not so much on the labor market, but it was on spending where people say, oh, where is it going? And it has obviously the consequence that some people little by little are thinking, I have the fear that this will not be any longer my country. And this is even stronger, and this is interesting in the German perspective, that this tendency is a lot stronger in the East, in the former GDR, after reunification, where a very small number of migrants live. Yeah. They are more in the industrialized centers in the West, but this strong feeling, this could not be any longer my country, this is stronger in the east of Germany, and this is a factor, for example, that right-wing populists in these areas are doing a lot better in elections and in opinion polls than they do in the West.
Yeah, I could go on this issue. It's such a difficult issue to tackle, but let me come to our third panelist for today. We have with us Mr. Sagun Sundar Lavoti, who is a spokesperson of Nepal's Rashtriya Prajatantra Party. I hope I got that right. Mr. Lavoti is a member of the Election Manifesto Drafting Committee, and he's been busy helping his party prepare for the elections, which are due to take place next month. Now, I've been reading that the electoral mood in Nepal is very intense at the moment, and I want to understand from you, how polarized is the voting population, around what issues, and how are you factoring it in your campaign?
Thank you, Shefali. I'll speak on, based on Nepal's experience, of course. So to give you a brief background, we had a violent conflict in Nepal from decade-long violent conflict from 1996 to 2006, and 17,000 lives were lost, and billions of worth of infrastructure was destroyed, and there was lost opportunities and psychological trauma, and we really took some time to get back to normal, things to get normal. And the Maoist party was behind the insurgency, and apparently the Maoist, the polarization then was, of course, ideological, but the Maoist party strategically took up caste and ethnic identity issues to stoke up, anti-establishment feelings. And also they talked about gender divide and all that issues. And we had a peace process, and the Maoists were taken aboard. They joined the mainstream politics. And we had a constituent assembly. In fact, we had 2 elections of constituent assembly, and through the assembly, we wrote a new constitution. And as a result, from the unitary structure, we shifted to 3 tiers of federal system of governance. And from the Westminster style of a constitutional monarchy, we shifted to a republic. And also from a Hindu state, we became a secular state. And we also took up a mixed electoral system. We only used to have first past the post, then we also adopted proportional representation system. This was to actually include and empower the disadvantaged and excluded groups. But again, like if you look at the developments after the new constitutions, we got a new constitution. Things have not been proper. The leaders who stoked this polarization, polarized the politics, they have not been able to walk the talk or walk back on the polarization that they created themselves. So we have a lot of disenchantment with among the public, and there's a new dynamics with a lot of people, younger generation people expressing their views in public affairs and politics of the day. So there are signs, like to give an example, I was talking yesterday also another panel. We had a local election in May 2021. And the younger lot of people, there was a little known rapper he was a candidate at the capital city of Kathmandu. He ran for the office of mayor, and he was never involved in active politics. So he was a first-time candidate, independent candidate, with no organizing base or a political structural base whatsoever. But alarmingly, or interestingly, surprisingly, He got about 64,000 votes, and the main ruling parties got the second. The candidate got only about 23,000. So this speaks that there's another set of dynamics building up. So this could be, again, if not addressed timely and properly, this could breed another kind of polarized politics in the country. Because these young lot they're not really concerned about what happened 20 years ago, but they want a safe and secure and, a place or environment so that they can work, and live a life.
Yeah. We'll come to the dynamism of the youth in a short while. But I want to ask you, in this era of coalition politics, is populism an issue of concern for you?
Indeed, but the coalition electoral practice has been new to Nepal. But like I said, the peace process actually has not delivered, and the process we took up thereafter has not delivered, and the PR system, the inclusion measures we've taken has only been superficial. So the dangers or the risk of the polarization taking form in that sense, in terms of caste and ethnic identity, continues. But if you're to ask me what kind of things are taking place in terms of public discourse or debate in terms of election, the major political parties are yet to make public the manifestos, so I cannot say categorically. But there are certain people, certain section of the society, want change, want alternative, in the sense that these, the Prime Minister, Mr. Sevabadi Deuba, was the Home Minister in 1991. So it's been about, say, 31 years he's been leading the government, leading the party. And the Maoist chairman, he's been leading his party for 33 years. So there was this, during the change, during the conflict time of transformation, we had this practice of consensus democracy, It was actually, the motive, the intent of the consensus democracy was to include the excluded. But what happened in practice was there were a couple of leaders from a couple of parties, they got together and they were sharing the spoils of the regime, government powers.
Yeah.
So it became a nexus of, and that still continues today, to this day. And what they do is to continue their hold, they polarize the society by, politicizing the state structures, and they politicize the judiciary. And there are so many examples I can give you, Yeah. So this goes on unabated, and so it's creating problems rather than solving things for us.
Yeah, there are leadership issues that we need to get into, but let me introduce Dr. Sandeep Shastri to you. He is one of India's leading political commentators and also the Vice Chancellor of the Jagran Lake City University in Bhopal. For quite some time yesterday, sir, I was mulling over a remark you made during the panel discussion on political strongman, and you said, where you stand is where you sit. I kept thinking about that for quite some time, and clearly you're a man of words. So how concerned are you about the use, or rather the abuse of rhetoric in political discourse and its a contribution to polarization?
Thank you. That is a matter of extremely great concern for me. When I look at my country, the region, and across the world. I think we are moving from what I put in the title of my slide, if it could be shown.
Sure.
We are moving from they.
Would you be able to use the clicker?
Can I do it from here? I don't know. No, it's not switching on. We need somebody there.
Yeah.
If I could put it in a sentence, the change is from us to we and they.
Okay.
The movement is from us to we and they. And for me, this symbolizes the type of polarization that we are seeing in the world.
Come on, yeah?
Being a data person, I'd like to use 3 data points, just that to indicate how, let's say in a country like India, the popular mood is actually something very different as seen in studies. And the way electoral politics put certain things on the forefront and certain things on the back foot is what is contributing to the challenge. And quickly, if I could share the 3 data points I wanted to discuss. This is based on a study we did in the last national election called the National Election Study. What type of leader do you want when people were asked? Being inclusive and secular, as high as 79% said this is something we strongly want. Somebody who is a consensus builder, as high as 98% people saying that's the type of leader we want. This is a debate that's going on a lot in India. Who does India belong to?
Yeah.
3/4 of the people say India belongs to all religions equally. So there is this desire to assert the diversity of the country and the unity of the country. But then there is also a matter of alarm which comes up in this particular slide that I'd like to show. And I'd like to focus on the green and red bars. I must concede my wife thinks I'm colorblind, so I think it is red. I don't know whether other people see it in another color. But the first 2 bars of every group of slides, which is the can't say and don't know and disagree. And the challenge for me is the bottommost one. In a democracy, the will of the majority should prevail. It's a half and half divide.
Right.
Which is where you see the start of the divide. Government should treat the minority the same way as the majority. 2/3 say yes, but 1/3 say could be, may not be. Government treating equal is not enough. The government should give special treatment to the minority. 48% saying could be a problem. And even if it is not liked by the majority, the government should protect the minority's interests. As high as 35%, 1/3 saying maybe. So this movement from us to we and they is partly seen in this, and I think mainly seen as countries in this region, and more specifically India, move towards the election cycle. This polarization becomes even more visible because across the political class, you want to demonize the opponent. You want to present the opponent as somebody who is very different from what I am. And in the process, you are causing this polarization, you are causing this division, you are causing this we and they rather than us. I would stop here, and when we come back later, I could discuss more issues on this.
Now, I would like to ask a question on what you just said. So, yes, elections are happening very frequently, and it's happening at different levels as well. So, I know I get into solutions later, but I'm just wanting to ask you, so is one of the solutions that election should take place after a certain defined period only, so that we can reduce the temperature in the country?
In fact, this is one of the suggestions that's on in India, that we seem to be in permanent election mode. And one of the agenda items the present government has put up is one nation, one vote. One vote means not one vote in one direction, but one vote at a time. Once in 5 years, the whole country votes for all elections that happen. And there is a debate in the country on that rather than being on permanent election mode, you do it once in 5 years, then devote the rest of the time to governance. Mm-hmm. And this debate is catching on.
Okay.
And it would be interesting to see how it proceeds as we go forward.
Great. I'll come back to you on that note a little bit later. Last but most certainly not least, I present to you fellow journalist who well shared her perceptions of strongmen and a strong woman as a reporter in Europe. For someone who loves being a reporter as well, I'm keen to know your views on how polarization is playing out in Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. I've been looking, because as you say, I'm a reporter, so I look daily into things. I look obviously more at the UK because I'm based in London, but I also looked in this context at Germany. I was very lucky to find a study by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, actually. Could you bring up these 2 slides? This is about polarization in Germany. if you look at the one on the right first, and I think this is in this context the most important one, people were asked, and this was a poll in the beginning of 2020 or in the summer of 2020, where people see themselves, whether more left or more right. Clearly the majority see themselves in the political center, which is something you would see in Britain as well. There were recent polls which reflected the same. On the left graph is about how do you see polarization of society before and during the pandemic. Now, it's very important to say this poll was done in the summer of 2020, when I should think the management of the pandemic was still going really smoothly. That changed rapidly after that. So it's not quite correct to think that people actually thought that the polarization in Germany was stronger before the pandemic. This has certainly changed, say from, and my German, like Frank, you will probably agree, from the rollout of the vaccines. The vaccines in Germany were incredibly polarized, very controversial. And I found another study saying that for politicians, it's such a challenge how to respond to grievances of society if it's such an emotional issue. And I don't know about your country and your friends and family, but there are several friends of mine I'm not talking to about vaccines, because I know we will fall out within a minute. It's a very emotional issue in Germany, not so much in Britain. In Britain, it's really different in that respect. Most people had the vaccine. I think it has a lot to do with the National Health Service, which is such an institution in Britain, and people trust science more in Britain than they do in Germany. And I'll just go quickly. I know you want me to be crisp and short. Could you show the next pictures? I know I do that. Okay, no, it's that one. Yeah, coming to Britain now, that's a completely different issue, but talking about polarization, I mean, what country is better to look at than Britain when it comes to Brexit? And I've just chosen 3 front pages of the Daily Mail. Okay, the Daily Mail obviously is a tabloid. The Daily Mail is very polarizing. The one on the left, The Enemies of the People, I can't see the date now exactly, but that was after the decision of the Supreme Court that the House of Commons should have a say when the negotiations with the European Union on leaving the European Union should be triggered. The British government at the time didn't want Parliament to come in, and there was actually Gina Miller, she's a broker, an economist. She then went to the courts and won that Parliament had to have a say in this. And the day after that, the Daily Mail called the judges enemies of the people. And let's look at the one on the right, which I find personally really upsetting. So proud of yourselves. This was then, I think, in 2019, when Boris Johnson really kicked out afterwards several of his own parliamentarians from his own political friends, so to say. There was a real purge going on in Britain at the time. And what I find personally upsetting of this, if you see the woman on this, so it's Nicky Morgan, Heidi Allen, and the last one, I can't see it from here. Who's the one next to Dominic Grieve, the blonde lady? Can you see it? Anyway, these 3 women, fabulous MPs, really representing their constituencies in a really, really good way. None of them run again at the next election. Why? Because they had so many threats, death threats, abuse, harassment. They decided for themselves and their families they didn't want to go back into politics, or active politics at least. So if you talk about how polarization really affects people personally, you can see this here very much on this front page, and I'll leave it there.
Absolutely. I'd actually like to go back to what you mentioned about the coronavirus vaccines issue, and I'm curious. Could you go a little bit deeper into what was the polarization around, and how did the government go about tackling it?
Well, the polarization, again, and I feel a bit awkward because I think my German colleagues who live in Germany have experienced that much more, but it was about the question whether you have the vaccine or not, at least in Germany. There was a lot of controversy and a lot of distrust. It happened around the AstraZeneca vaccine as well. There were comments, for example, by the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who flippantly said he wasn't quite sure if that vaccine is really effective. I think then in Germany there is also a tendency, people are quite into alternative medicine. Like my sister-in-law, she wouldn't have the vaccine. She was absolutely convinced that it wouldn't make a difference. She then only had the vaccines because she wanted to keep on flying to Mallorca. Mm-hmm. So then, because you would have to have the vaccine to go on a plane. So it was, I think there was very little consent on the effectiveness of the vaccine. People felt bullied into it. Of course, then there was, if I remember correctly, a time when the German government considered mandatory vaccination, which is something in Britain people couldn't believe because people would have it anyway. Mm. So the question of solidarity, I think, the societal solidarity was very much questioned. And then, of course, it was mixed up with the question of lockdowns. And there I agree more about children not going to school for months on end, which has, I think, damaged a lot of, especially teenagers. So just it was something that after the refugee crisis, and now we see it in a way again with the war in Ukraine, people felt very emotional, very strongly about, and it split society.
Yeah, I mean, especially I think health is a very serious issue, and that impacts our lives. I had a chance to interview Mr. Albert Bourla. He's the CEO of Pfizer in Davos earlier this year, and I wrote about the interview, and his key recommendation was just take the vaccine, protect yourself. And it became one of our best read articles, and I was like feeling good, the message is going out. But then I decided to dive into the comment section, and everyone was like, forget it, you just want to make money, you're profiting, and that's why you're encouraging us to take the vaccines. So it is a deeply divisive issue. But I also want to come to the second point you made, which was about the impact of polarization. Do you get the feeling that people in leadership positions are really concerned about the impact that deeply polarization can have on our societies?
You mean politicians and representatives?
Yeah, I mean, they are at the forefront of it, and sometimes stoking different kind of sentiments. So,
of course, they have to be, because they have to respond to them, whether they want to be re-elected or whether. I mean, we just had the case now in Britain where Boris Johnson had to resign, and then Liz Truss, who's now the Prime Minister, was running for 2 months. There was a leadership contest in Britain, and I think at times actually she decided to push for polarization. So there was a comment she did, for example, there's a very historical, interesting relationship I observed between the United Kingdom and France. And at one of the hustings, she was asked, is Emmanuel Macron a friend or a foe? And her contender, Rishi Sunak, he of course said, of course he's a friend. But Liz Truss chose to say, well, the jury's out there. So there is, I think, and that's something, if you have in mind the graph we saw about that most people position themselves in the political center, I think there's a tendency by politicians, especially when they are campaigning, because they are speaking to a certain audience, to actually trigger polarization, which I think at the end of the day is very irresponsible.
Actually, can I ask my fellow panelists to draw in on this issue, this increasing polarization and the tendency of politicians to pander to certain political interests? It has long-term implications.
My own reflection on this point is when the different political parties realize we are not able to focus on issues of development and those issues which concern people in their day-to-day lives, they find it more convenient then to raise emotional issues, issues which in some ways divide society, be it majoritarian consolidation, minority consolidation, because then that allows you to shift attention away from a critical issue of possible failure of the opposition to highlight or failure of the government to implement. Because survey after survey in India shows that what is the most important problem that people face, invariably one of these three will be on the top. Unemployment, price rise, inflation. Now, if these are the key issues, our sense is voters should be voting on these issues. And if that happens, sometimes the type of electoral results you're seeing should not be taking place. So it's very clear that what are people's issues go on the back burner. And these emotive issues, which in the short run can fetch you very rich political dividends, come to the fore. Sometimes overlooking the fact that its long-term consequences on social stability could actually be impacted.
Yes. What is the situation in Nepal?
During the conflict and the Maoist party, like I said earlier, which is based on Marxist theory, they actually focus on class issues. But they took up caste and ethnic issues, identity. So that was a strategic ploy to play with the sentiments and the feelings of the people and, polarize the society. But things have not taken really, change has been superficial. Like there is 33% compulsory representation for women in all political parties, the Central Working Committee. But all the political parties, even those who propounded change, were at the forefront of the change, are yet to, religiously follow that constitutional provision. And if you look at the leadership roles, the minority groups, the disadvantaged groups like the Dalits, or even women, even the indigenous peoples are yet to lead the government. They haven't had the opportunity to lead the governments or lead the parties. So the change have been, far too little and far too, has not been forthcoming. So the sentiment has always been, so they're losing ground, and what they're doing is they're breaching on, they're flouting the rule of law, and they're politicizing judiciary. For instance, to further their political gains and to grab on the power, they impeached the Chief Justice. They impeached the Chief Justice, but they didn't take the motion to the vote in the parliament. So this misusing the democratic values and all that. So in fact, this is creating new set of grounds for polarizing the society further on. They're not being able to deliver, and the younger lot, basically, the younger generation are making the voices heard, though they're not directly involved in politics. They're taking things in the hand.
True. Mr. Priest, any suggestions on how do we make national progress in terms of conflicting political interests?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do as well. And when I look to the former answers, with the party system and with the electoral system as well. If you have a political system which is purely majority vote, obviously you behave different as you do when you have such a system, for example, in Germany, where always coalitions are coming out, where after elections, after polarization of a campaign, you need to compromise with others, because if not, you won't be in government. And in this case, for example, on the one hand, problems for the party is that it's difficult to have a very clear profile for the voters because you always compromise. But on the other hand, you avoid a little bit the polarization. And we had good experiences for a long time with broad-based people's parties who say, okay, we do compromise in the party as well because our aim is to have 50+1 in the vote at least. So all the social groups are represented in a party, and it's a precondition compromise in some sense. This helps a lot. On the other hand, if you have this aspects, winner takes it all, in this moment you behave different. And looking, for example, to United States with the manipulation of districts, voting districts, you know, your problem is the primary inside your own party and not the general election, because the district is in such a way that you will win with 20-30% of difference. So you behave different, you behave more radical, and even that there are a lot of members of parliament writing before that they would never compromise coming to Washington. This is something which would be absolutely impossible in Germany still. On the other hand, with the polarization, when I heard the former takes, I once again asked myself, when does polarization start? For example, on the vaccines or in other issues. Yes. You see in Germany that 2/3 of the people is vaccinated and 2/3 of the people do not have any problem with this. They have problems a little bit with this lack of clear communication, which was mentioned yesterday. But is it a polarization if 20% are very outspoken? There the media has their role. They are seen a lot stronger than they really in society are. But if 80% agree on an issue, is this polarization or is it not? Is it the extreme right or the extreme left? In Germany, you could say, okay, there's extreme left party with 5% and a right-wing populist with 10%. So in international comparison, you would say we do quite well. So it's a mixed picture.
Yeah. I think on the point that you raised about electoral reforms, you know, and what the political system really is, we need a full session to understand that particular part. Dr. Rahman, I would like to ask you, we are seeing more and more polarization in recent times, and what would you ascribe it to? Is it just the ease of communication? Is it because there are so many social media platforms that are now unregulated? Or is it the pandemic? You know, we're coming out of 2 years of like seclusion, and people are keen to get what they want. You know, it's been a period of frustration for many people. So they've just become more demanding. What is your own take on what is contributing to increasing polarization?
That is a really good question. So I'm going to try to give you a very good answer. Put it this way. Social media, and then those who work in media, I was a journalist a long time ago, like to pay attention to what is happening now, what is trending now. But we don't really, but many people, I suppose social media users and media people, do not really see, or maybe need to see a little bit more, what is the root cause of polarizations. How we can see that polarization is not a new thing. It is something that has been embedded in our society. It is something that's going to harm us over time, regardless of during the elections, prior to the election, after elections. We were just a tribal creature. So what I'm saying is that, are we going to keep the business of polarizations alive and sustain? That's going to give those who wanting power to have more power. The reasons what I'm giving you in this perspective is that I'm working on the ground. I'm working with the grassroots communities, with marginalized groups. So for example, if we are looking at what's happening on social media, there is an abundance of research that says, yes, we become more polarized. The research, the survey, and everything like that. But hold on a second. I lived in Florida before. If you from the US, you know that the South is kind of deeply polarized. And then I live in Singapore. We all know that Singapore is very pragmatic and compromising, which is great. Then I live in Vietnam now. What I can see is that it is more important to try to depolarize the society and not to amplify the tendency of those in power. I keep repeating myself about it because most people tend to see polarization as something that, yeah, it's there. But let's think about the benefactors of the polarizations. Are we talking about politicians? Are we talking about the stock traders? Are we talking about those people who will get benefit from it? So when it comes to, are we talking about solutions already?
So sorry.
Are we talking about solutions at the moment?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can I show like a
Yeah.
like
you can.
one slide that we're probably going to summarize. Can you go to slides number 8, please? I don't have the remote control. Yes, thank you. So these are some of the things that I believe relevant to our conversation today. So this idea I developed from looking at what's happening when people live in a post-conflict society. So when we're thinking about post-conflict society, it is kind of resembling the polarizations that we are facing today. A lot of distrust, a lot of tribalisms, a lot of me against you and them and things like that. And of course, you will hear people, you're going to say, oh, there is always bad people and good people on the both side. No, you need to call it as bad, as good is good. But what I'm saying here, 3 ideas that I developed based on more than 5 years looking at post-conflict society. Let's think about the immunity against disinformations. Polarization stems from informations. And if we live in a post-conflict society or in a polarized world, we're going to think that, hey, the Christian is bad, the Muslim is bad, the black is kind of ugly, the white is kind of this and that. And then we're thinking about in Singapore, the Chinese taking over a bunch of different things, the Indian, the Malay, bunch of different things. We always have that, but we have to be able to kind of develop our immunity against misinformations, which in a conflict situations, rumors, misinformation circulating really, really bad. And the people who have experienced communal conflicts, they manage to be able to develop this kind of immunity against disinformations. The second idea is revitalizations of third places. We all know that social media is good and bad. It depends where you are. I was looking at social movements. Activists use social media to amplify whatever they believe is good in the society. But then, social media is where the ugly things happen. So what happened in post-conflict society is that they revitalized their third places. In the context of Ambon, Indonesia, when I was looking at my data, was cafes, restaurants, the little tiny simple things that we are trying to neglect, that we do not really pay attention to these days, because we are trying to take a look at what is sexy, what is fancy on social media. Well, people, for example, the Christian and Muslim, they just hang at the cafe, they talk random things, they avoid certain things that are going to polarize them, and over time, they become friends, become buddies, good friends, even get married. So that's what happened at the grassroots. If we're looking at as well, let's say different part of Indonesia, we can see the Chinese and Javanese Indonesia, the Jews and the Muslim, they are good neighbors. So yeah, when we're looking at the macro data and the business of polarization, we can always say bad thing happens. But I'm here to give hope, something that we do not really have as we live in fears these days. The last part is about reconstructions of collective identity. This is based on the experience of people who have been in a protracted conflict. So they're looking at their experience, their conflict experience. If you live in a polarized society or in a conflicting society, you have a tendency to have the idea, you are Muslim, you're rapists. Oh, you are the Christian, you are the perpetrators of the conflict. These are the conflict narratives. But as the society moves towards a peaceful phase, then they are trying to think, no, we are all complicit in letting the conflict to happen. If we achieve that kind of common grounds, then we can depolarize the society organically. And then the other 2 points related to the construction of collective identity are the idea that we have a common goal. For example, in the city that I was looking at, rather than thinking that we are, they're thinking that they want to advance the city after 10 years of conflicts. Do we have a common goal or not? That is something that we forget sometimes. And the politicians, no offense politicians in the audience, like to amplify the hate that we have on the other community. And then the last bit, relation to the construction of collective identity, is that can we move beyond our identity as white, Asian, black, Chinese, Indian, Ambonese, or whatever it is that you affiliate with into something that connects us as a human being. I know you're going to call it cliche and cheesy, but when I'm talking to people on the grounds, the same question that you ask, what can we do to depolarize the society? Let's try to see each other as a human being and forget what the news said, what the politician is trying to manipulate us. Don't hate me, politicians. I'm just conveying what I have heard on the ground. I hope that's not too long answer to your question.
No, it isn't. And I think we have a lot to discuss, especially on the point about solutions. I was seeing Dr. Shastri nodding his head vigorously, and I was wondering, would you like to contribute at this gesture?
I fully add my voice to what was said. A small added point with regard to social media on this question. A recent study that we did in India on the impact of social media showed that social media reinforces choices, does not change choices.
Right.
That if you look at choices which people make, social media reinforces what I already believe in. And when people get a message, what do? If it endorses what you believe in, you pass it on to like-minded people.
Yeah.
You receive a message you don't believe in, you delete it immediately. And therefore, what is happening here is you are reinforcing choices which you already have. And to a certain extent, has that also somewhere contributed to the polarization that we are seeing in society? You did mention about the road forward in terms of the possible solutions.
Yeah.
And let me just quickly bullet 2 points on that. Soon after the 2019 elections, in his first acceptance speech, the Prime Minister made a very strong point in India. His slogan during the election had been, take everybody along and bring about everybody's development. It sounds very poetic when it is said in an Indian language. He added a third line to that in his victory speech, which was, gain the confidence of everyone as you go along. And I thought this gain the confidence of everyone as you go along. And those who can follow Hindi would know, sabka saath, sabka vikas, and then he added, sabka vishwas. See, gain the confidence of people as you go along. Which I thought was like that balm, much needed balm that was needed in society to stem that polarization which had happened. So my first point, I think leadership plays a critical role in being able to get their cadres and their followers to be less divisive, And secondly, I would say to move from this carnival of hate to the carnival of hope, what we need is a focus on the bread and butter issues before the people. So if the political elite is able to focus on the bread and butter issues which actually make the people feel that the process is close to us, I think, and again, evidence has shown that when governments have performed and put that before the people, more often than not, they have been voted back to power. So I think a return to that fundamental agenda of people's challenges and problems is, I think, the way to plug and stem this process of polarization we are now seeing.
Yeah, I think if you can meet the needs of people, you are reducing the polarization. And but Steph, let me ask you, like, how do we depolarize society? Are you seeing effective examples as part of your work that you would like to talk about? And also, what role does education play in all this? You would think that education broadens the mind, but you're seeing polarization in highly developed societies as well. So is it that the educational systems need to change or to evolve to another level?
Many questions there, but let's just pick up on the education system or the education question. I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with a a lecturer here from Singapore University on that, because we both observe in teenagers, because we happen to have teenagers, that they are actually very opinionated, and you can see that also on social media. There's a lot of commenting and emojis, and every time something bigger happens, you see them commenting lots of Snapchat or Instagram or whatever, also celebrities doing that. But then the other day, because one of my teenagers is turning 18, and she got this, in Britain you have to register to vote. And she had to send in her passport, and she said, no, I can't be bothered. I said, how you can't be bothered? You can't vote if you're not registered. And she said, oh, why would I bother to vote? So I think if we're talking about social media and the influence of social media on the young generation, it's my completely impression. It's anecdotal, and you have to back it up with studies. But I think it's a really worrying trend that on the one hand, they are very opinionated, but it's very superficial, and they live in this virtual world. And think that at the end of the day, it's also it's really hard work to vote. Oh my God, I might have to go to a polling station. So I think there's also for politicians, there is a challenge there to think about e-voting, for example. Can you e-vote? Because I know that in Estonia, which is a very progressive, is a very small country, but they, after the transformation from communism, they already introduced e-voting, have a very high political participation, especially of young people. Young people live in a virtual world. They have a lot of opinions, but they're actually, the transition from a click to doing something is widening. And I think to engage young people, there have to be practical measures being taken by governments. They have to be much more inventive and innovative to involve young people and to make them understand that it's not enough to do a like on Facebook,
Right.
but to really engage.
True, I couldn't agree with you more, but I do have a lot more questions. But let me ask our audience, do you have any questions for our panelists? Please come to the mic, introduce yourselves, and raise your question. You'll have to come to the mic there. Sure.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Melalas Moras from PTV4 from the Philippines. So I would like to ask about the role of media in the issue of political polarization. For us journalists, what do you think are the measures that we must do to avoid being used to further enable polarization? Or what's the best thing to do to effectively handle a polarized story without further polarizing it? Anyone can answer.
I'll take a shot at that. My first response would be journalists should focus on ensuring that we are delivering fact-based information. So that goes a long way in addressing, thoughts of confusion that people have in their minds. And the more you focus on ensuring that your work is fact-based, you're making a contribution. But I'm going to quickly invite my panelists to share their views on the role of media in addressing polarization.
Okay. I'm just going to give you an illustration. Back in 1999 to 2004, during the conflict in Ambon, Indonesia, the media, quote unquote, was accused of promoting the conflict. They used the words that promote violence. They used the words that are insensitive to the feelings of the survivors and the adversaries and those who are engaged in conflicts. I'm going to give you for example. If the headline said something like, these cities are in conflict, but what actually happened on the ground, there was a riot or quarrel in the city. So that is just an example. So to put it in a broader view, how about if we are trying as a journalist to put a people-centric approach? You mentioned about facts. I am looking at the people-centric approach. This applies, for example, if you're looking at people who are in conflict. Remember that you only probably can access certain areas when the conflict occurred because of the way you look, because of your names, because of skin color. If you are black, it is hard to access, for example, the white neighborhood. If you are Muslim, it is hard to access the Christian neighborhood. So most often during the conflict, you only get a portion of the information that you need. So try to pay attention to the people that you are interviewing with or you talk with. And then second, not only people-centric approach, is about being sensitive to what you are reporting will affect polarizations. If our angle is try, again, to widen the polarizations, then if more violence happen, then it is on you. The same thing I would say about social media. Can you go to the last slide, just a quick?
Sure, okay.
To the slide number 12, if that's possible. Is that possible? Because it's related to what you're asking as a journalist. Most of us thinking about, I don't get the things there. Okay, so many of us think about users, like one of the panelists mentioned. It's good to pay attention to the users, media literacy and stuff like that. But hold on a second. We need to think about the enablers, the social media platforms. We need to hold them accountable. That is the first point I made regarding the current future challenges in relation to what you're asking and in relation to what the panel is saying. We cannot let social media platforms take advantage of our vulnerability, exploit our emotions, exploit our tribal tendency. And that's how polarization is so much on social media. And again, stop blaming on the users. The users are on the platform, so make sure the platforms are accountable to create, again, a safe, secure, and trustworthy spaces for the users.
Mr. Priest, you were wanting to join the conversation.
Yeah, I have a little bit of problem if it's too harmonic to say what should be done and what could journalists do and what could others do. It's important to think about that. But if you look to the real world, you see that in many cases the working conditions for journalists are in a way that conflict, dramatization, polarization is a business model. You know that your ratings are going up when you are a talk show host in the United States and stirring up the people. You see in social media, the more polarized you are, the more likes you get. It's if you compromise, if you are a people middle of the road, in this moment you have a problem. And there is a saying in the United States, it's easy to be brilliant if you do not even try to be fair. And I think this works for journalism as well. And the examples, for example, Stephanie Bolson showed with the Daily Mail or with the Murdoch Press or with others, they are doing very well in financial terms, exactly betting on polarization. And talk shows, for example, the composition of talk shows, it's not the idea to have an intelligent debate like Tony Abbott yesterday said. It's clear everybody has its role, and if you do not play your role and if you do not have the sentence people are expecting, you are not invited once again. So this has a lot to do with the media system and with the working condition of journalists. A lot of people made the experience studying journalism in university, and then you are entering the newsroom, and the first you heard is forget everything what you heard in university. It's not the real world, and especially when it comes to professional ethics. It's nice to say we should do this, but the problem is more on the regulation and all this issues as well. And we have to admit that it's not always the politicians who live on polarization. We have quite successful politicians which are very much middle of the road. For example, our German situation with Angela Merkel, who could somebody be 16 years as a head of government with a quite boring middle of the road style, not visionary, but people say, oh, I feel comfortable with this person. It's an authentic person. But on the other hand, if you say, okay, my aim is to get 10% of the vote, you always will get community saying, okay, if they have the feeling this is our politician, you will get this percentage. And the religious factor, for example, we see a lot of religious hate which come from priests in the one hand or the others. So it's very difficult to say what could be really work, and not only speak about what would be desirable.
Yeah, there's so many different dimensions to consider. Steph, how would you react to that, the role of media in addressing polarization?
It's a very difficult question. It's a challenging one, and as Frank just said, it's a business model. Of course it is. And in the situation in Germany, of course, I think one could say it started with the refugee crisis. So, as mentioned before, when this all started, there was always a euphoric atmosphere in Germany when thousands and 10,000s of Germans were standing at the central stations in Munich and other places welcoming refugees, and there was a quiet majority of people who did not feel comfortable with that, and some media capitalized on that after a while. First there was a very almost universal positive echo in the media, and then some media noticed that actually there is a growing sentiment in the population that people felt overwhelmed and picked up on that, and this has been the same or similar also during the pandemic. So in my newspaper, for example, we had very outspoken critics of the vaccines and especially of the lockdowns. And I mean, bluntly, we gained subscriptions because people felt like they were understood in our paper. And I mean, I find this truly difficult. I battle with that myself every day, because on the one hand you might say, yeah, well, you're just feeding certain sentiments, but on the other hand you might also say, well, it's freedom of speech, it's freedom of opinion. It's important to give a forum, not to every opinion, but to people who say, I'm not comfortable about having the vaccine, or I'm not comfortable about 1 million refugees coming into the country. But of course, at the same time, you have a massive responsibility not to polarize and not to steer sentiments that are negative and then will be echoed in elections, for example. If you look at, and Frank mentioned that, if you look at East Germany, and now the war, so the war in Ukraine and the question of sanctions and the questions of delivering weapons to Ukraine, there's a complete split between West and East Germany. And in East Germany, the support for sending weapons to Ukraine is far lower than in the West. At the same time, the polls for the AfD, the right-wing party, they are leading in some countries, like in Sachsen-Anhalt or in Thüringen. They might be winning the next election. So, yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Shastri, you were also nodding your head, so.
I think on the question of the impact of social media, 3 consistent studies that we have done in India, one in 2019, one in 20, and one last year, show when people were asked among the various medias, which one do you actually trust for information? Consistently, there has been a particular order. Print media, electronic media, social media.
Okay,
First came print media, next came electronic media, and third came social media in terms of trust. And I go back to my earlier point. I think social media more has played a role in reinforcing what you believe rather than changing what you believe. And in that sense, for me, social media has been one of the factors causing the polarization that you see.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that, but I am keen to take up another question that came up. Please come. In fact, I'll take 2 or 3 questions so we can try and answer as many as possible.
Hi, good morning. I'm Ron from the Philippines. Thanks very much for the very interesting discussion. I came from the country where we just held probably the most divided, polarized election. Just to give you an idea of how polarized it is, you know, there were times during the election when we no longer look at the social media because there's so much hate in it. There are relatives who don't talk to each other after knowing who they voted in the elections, or people who don't date someone that they know they voted or supported a certain candidate. So I wanted to pick on the ways that Dr. Ruman said about depolarizing And one of the point is to have a collective identity. And just wanted to know if that is the way forward, or don't you think it's the very reason why we have this polarization? Because we try to group ourselves, we try to look at ours, like me from we, from us. Don't you think it will only further worsen the polarization of the society? Is it better to have no border, no religion, no, I don't know, John Lennon said that, yeah. So what do you think of that way to not see ourselves with countries, with religions, basically not as a collective nationalities?
Conflicting ideas, but just give us a few minutes. I'm going to take Mr. Bayuni. You had a question. Please come up. Please come up to the mic. Mr. Anam, please come to the mic. You can ask your question too.
Thank you. Again, very interesting discussion. My question is short. Well, we have speakers from Germany, India, UK, Nepal, Vietnam, and we are here in Singapore. Different levels of democracy. My question is, do you think polarization tends to flourish more in democratic society than in society that are governed by authoritarian or strongmen? Thank you.
Very good question.
In the discussion on polarization, I think a very clear distinction should be made between polarization on basis of issues and polarization on the basis of race and religion. Because these are the polarization that lasts, and it germinates and then it really becomes destructive. But polarization on issues of vaccine is good or bad, Brexit is good or bad or something, these are part of social evolutionary debates which sometimes may be destructive, but in a democracy it is expected. So I would like to suggest that those of us who are looking at polarization as journalists, as scholars, as policymakers, must make a very serious distinction. Because polarization on the basis of religion and on race, it lasts.
Great. I saw a couple of more hands. Please come and express your questions, please.
Thank you. So my question is, who is deciding the agenda, whether the political party is a politician or media organization, media entrepreneurs are deciding the agenda? Means when we are living in this time of social media democracy, we have shifted from social democracy to social media democracy, this televised democracy. Even leaders are now deciding what to wear, about how to behave. Because every time you are in the front of TV or cameras. So who is deciding the agenda? Because now, yesterday I also said, again I am reiterating that, now from citizen we have reduced to mere users. Means market made us consumer and social media is making us users. So from citizens to user, this journey is taking all the credits, and now I think media, so who is deciding the agenda? Means as he said that for TRP, for your viewership, means even media organizations are doing a bit more than our politicians. Thank you.
True. I'll take one more last question. Yeah.
Yeah, good morning. Just a very short questions to all the speakers, perhaps from Germany, the UK, and Nepal, and also India. What is your opinion, or maybe do you have any information? What is your government do to deal with the polarization in terms of politics, especially to make the social media platform like Facebook, YouTube accountable to this kind of political distraction? Because if I come to my research last 2 years in Indonesia, I come to the conclusion that instead of trying to educate the social media user, we need to ensure that our social media corporation need to be more accountable to filterizing the content, and also there is the need to government intervention, or perhaps the autonomous media agencies intervention to deal with this issue, that target that the goal is how to ensure social media platform corporations manage this kind of issues in terms of toward especially the presidential election in the coming years. So I need to know the experience of Germany, the UK, also Nepal and India, how the respective government deal with this issue. Thank you.
Right, we're running out of time. We have 5 interesting points. I'm going to request my panelists to pick one and try and answer them. The issue of should we have collective identity or not, social media accountability, differentiating between what is causing polarization on, is it race, religion, or otherwise. Also, the very interesting question from Pa Indy about polarization in democratic and autocratic societies. I would certainly like to hear anyone's thoughts on that. Should we start with you and just go down the line?
Okay, I'm trying to summarize and trying to give a succinct answer. For Ron, specifically because you addressed a question to me, I would say collective identity can be beneficial if we are collecting, if we identify ourselves as a common force, not trying to put ourselves as an individual identity. So we have collective identity, we have individual identity. For example, if the country is facing hard times during the pandemics, in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore, one of the common messaging strategies that the government used was that we are here together and join hands in many different ways in their own languages. So that's going to lead to the next question from Pa Andi, I believe, because I grew up in Indonesia, I live in the US, I live in Singapore, and then now I live in Vietnam. If you are a fan of the democracy index, you can see the trajectory of my life, from really democratic to a communist country. Okay, I'm not supposed to talk about that, but that's the reality. So what I'm saying is that it exists all the time, but in not really democratic country, it's less polarized. The reason is we all have been harmonized. So that's the key. So here we're thinking about how strong is strong, how weak is weak. When we can balance the benefit of having a polarized society where debates happen, where innovations occur, and when we can mitigate the risk of polarizations from destroying our social fabrics. I'm not going to say that Singapore is the best model. I'm not going to say that. Or I'm not going to say that China is the best model. Or I'm not going to say that Vietnam is the best model. But what I'm going to say is we need to acknowledge, for example, Vietnam, where I'm currently living, during the pandemic, it was successfully tamed the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic, but media didn't pay attention to it because partially it was a communist country. So we know that we all here, maybe many of us here, are biased toward democracy. That is something that probably a narrative that I keep hearing because I live in the other side of democracy.
Right. Mr. Priest.
Yeah, just a short take, because there was a lot of question. I think for me the essence is that in democracy you need to live with some different opinions, which can lead to polarization. This sometimes is inevitable when people are speaking freely and open. And Tony Abbott yesterday made it very clear from a liberal standpoint. I think this kind of debate, and it was mentioned about issues about religion, there are differences, and therefore I think it's necessary to have clear rules, and laws when it comes to hate speech, when it comes to this kind of defamation. We need regulation as well for social media. It was the debate in different panels yesterday, and I think this is key. And for everybody, the education issue was important. Investing in qualified public opinion in people. This is very important and for all of us, and this is not a surprise for somebody working in a political foundation. I think it's important that everybody gets engaged in politics and make politics better.
Truly.
I think for democracy to deliver, there needs to be a connect between the leadership and the people's aspirations, and we need to deliver things. And maybe the lack of identity or collective identity could be an ideal situation at certain certain instances, but like I don't think we can deal away with that completely. So best way forward could be, say for the media or the civil society, even the political actors, to present not only dividing opposing views, but also offer solutions, potential solutions to the public debate and discourse.
I'd just like to respond to one point, the point which our friend from Indonesia made at the end. I think this regulation is a double-edged sword. There was a term which we used to use very frequently in India for regulation, that it should be light but tight. You keep the regulation light but keep it tight on issues. But the challenge was, what should have been light became tight, and what should have been tight became light, and it defeated the whole purpose. So that's why I said it's a double-edged sword. Yes, it requires a regulation, but that regulation needs to be very, very, very carefully calibrated. Otherwise, you would actually lose the purpose for which you want to bring in that regulation.
Yeah, very briefly, I would like to pick up on the point again on which was a distinction between polarization about race and religion and, say, Brexit. And I agree, of course, this is part of democracy, and you have to have strong arguments about both sides. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think there's a limit to this, because people become more and more disenfranchised. And there was a recent poll in Britain that said 3 of 5 Britons think they feel exhausted by the division in politics. And if people then are getting so exhausted that they turn away from news, and they turn away especially from politics and election, who is going to vote at the end of the day? So those who are loud, those who are shouting. And I think, well, again, I'm a bit cautious because I'm not living in Germany. I think so far German politicians are rather cautious. But if I look at Britain, at recent comments by the prime ministers, whether it's Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, they actually have been seeking to steer emotions and this very loud shouting. So I think there is a responsibility, especially in politicians, to tune it down.
True. I think I would like to say that what we need to have is a lot more conversation and a lot more emphasis and discussion on this whole issue. And the more informed discussions we have and the more inclusive discussions we have might make some contribution towards addressing the issue. Can I request everyone to join me to thank all our wonderful panelists in the usual way? There are some housekeeping rules. There's CAS has lined up a wonderful coffee break, and it's at the foyer. It commences now. You have 30 minutes to also engage with our panelists there as well. At 11:10 a.m., the conference will separate into 2 breakout rooms. This room will host a session on the use of big data in political communication, moderated by Jake Manabat. Not sure if he's here. While in room B next door, we'll host a session on alternate methods of storytelling and engagement, moderated by Dr. Daniel King. I hope I've got your surname right. The conference hashtag is ACPC22. Thank you, and we'll see you again.